Welcome, everybody, to this last day of a four-part series organized by the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank and the German Institute for Development Evaluation, DEval, on evidence for climate action. My name is Jörg Faust. I'm the director of DEval, and I also currently serve as the chair of the EvalNet, the OECD EvalNet, which is the responsible body within the Development Assistance Committee of the DAC for evaluation. In this series on evidence for climate action, many prestigious experts in evaluation and research organizations have already presented evidence on the findings related to such important topics as the blue economy, resilience, and climate finance. In the final part of this series today, we will focus on the topic of mitigation, namely balancing mitigation and economic growth. What is the role of transformative portfolios, green bonds, and green energy? In efforts to mitigate climate change through development cooperation, policymakers, whether in development agencies or in our partner countries, face the dual challenge of promoting socioeconomic development while at the same time making a substantial contribution to reducing emissions. To effectively navigate this potential tension, research and evaluation is asked to produce helpful evidence that responds to basic principles of good evaluation, namely independence, credibility, and usefulness. But it should also be evidence that addresses the relevance, the effectiveness, the efficiency, the impact, and of course, the sustainability of measures aimed at balancing this potential tension between mitigation and economic growth. And of course, such evidence should be used by both, should be produced and used by both agencies of international development cooperation, but of course, also policymakers and researchers and actors in our partner countries. And against this background, I'm looking very much forward to this session, which has a topic which is for us at DEval, of course, and for German Development Cooperation, but I guess for most of us at this session of utmost importance. Thank you very much again for joining this session. And by this, I hand over to Megan Kennedy-Chouane, who is responsible for the EvalNet Secretariat and who will have the pleasure to moderate this session. Megan, over to you, and thanks again.
Thank you very much, Jörg, and thank you to the organizers. I'm delighted to be with you today to discuss these important topics. And we have a really great lineup of speakers, so we are looking forward to hearing from them. As Jörg mentioned, today's session focuses on discussing the opportunities, challenges, and arguably or debatably the conflicting goals of stimulating pro-poor development, public action for achieving sustainable development goals related to health, human well-being, and social outcomes, while at the same time reducing polluting greenhouse gases and trying to achieve climate-related goals, trying to stave off the ongoing climate crisis and collapse. So we're looking in particular today at the role of some key areas of climate mitigation finance and the green bonds, and how these can serve as a gap to help bridge the gap between development goals and climate goals. And we will hear several different on-the-ground perspectives from Sweden and from elsewhere. So I'm delighted to have with us today Numi Ostlund, who is on the ground in Sweden and will share with us the findings from a really interesting evaluation that he has just concluded with the expert group of for aid studies, EBA, in Sweden, looking at Swedish efforts to promote climate mitigation through international development finance. And then we will turn to a distinguished panel of three experts who will both reflect on Numi's findings and his presentation, and also bring in their own perspectives and their own understandings, particularly around this issue of trade-offs and perceived trade-offs. So we will then hear from Oskar Andruszkiewicz, who's the Senior Evaluation Manager at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We will hear from Ombeline de Bock, an evaluator at the European Investment Bank, and from Tabitha Olang, the Africa Regional Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Manager for the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. So we will hear from the three of them. We will then have some time for discussion and hopefully questions from all of you in the audience. Please do feel free to share your questions in the chat, and our colleagues in the back office will also be gathering those questions as well as sharing additional resources in the Zoom chat. Thank you very much, and without further ado then I will hand over to Numi. Please tell us more about this evaluation and where you've landed.
Well, thank you, Megan, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone, depending on a bit where you are. So yes, as Megan said, I'll be presenting insights from a recent evaluation of Swedish climate change mitigation finance, focusing on three different institutions. It's SIDA, the Swedish Development Agency, Swedfund, the Swedish DEval, and the Nordic Development Fund, NDF. And I'll throw some slides up here for you. There we are. So hopefully, I mean, these are three Swedish/Scandinavian or Nordic institutions, but I do think and hope that these conclusions from this evaluation will be relevant for many. These three portfolios that we have evaluated share projects, investments, and themes with many other international donors and development finance institutions. So in this presentation, I will be making two main points. The first is that there does not have to be a trade-off between mitigation and development, depending a bit on the type of financing and the time scope. The second point is to reiterate a point already been made during the sessions this week, is the need for transparency in climate finance, in climate efforts, and in mitigation efforts. Briefly about this evaluation, it was conducted together with experts from Climate Perspectives Research, Stockholm Environment Institute, and the Swedish Environment Research Institute. A lot of experts. The evaluation sought to determine whether funding from these three institutions, so SIDA, Swedfund, and NDF, whether they can be said to be contributing significantly to mitigation by 2030, so the short-term perspective. We focused on part of these portfolios, that is mitigation finance. So that is mitigation finance that's intending to contribute to mitigation, but also to mobilize additional resources for mitigation efforts. A few words on the key findings, and I think one of the main findings was the heavy focus in these portfolios on the energy sector in Africa, and specifically on renewable energy generation. Something I think we'll be talking a bit more about in the panel. The evaluation reveals that in these three portfolios, there's short-term limitations in the portfolio's potential impact. Basically, these portfolios are not expected to contribute to mitigation in a significant manner by 2030. This is partly due to the focus on low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where while important for development, from a development perspective, they have relatively low greenhouse gas emissions at the moment. Furthermore, direct mitigation results like reduced emissions are not expected until late 2030s or even into the 2040s due to the long-term nature of these investments. They focus on capacity building, market building, and supporting renewable energy investments that will see the light of day in terms of emissions reductions in 10 to 15 years. But while the expected short-term mitigation impact is limited, these portfolios still have a significant long-term potential. They aim to support low emissions development pathways, which is crucial for the long-term fight against climate change. By promoting clean energy and market development in developing countries, these three evaluated institutions hope to enable these countries to achieve economic growth without dramatically increasing emissions. Well, at the same time, the evaluation also suggests that these portfolios can improve their transformative potential. That is the focus on scale, on speed, on systemic change, for example, the type of change needed to make significant contributions. There are quite a few conclusions in the report, in the evaluation, but I will emphasize one of them, and that's the importance of transparency. And for those of you who were in the session yesterday, you heard Thomas also in his presentation underlining the importance of transparency in climate finance, and this is very much echoed in our report. A crucial takeaway from this evaluation is the need for greater transparency in climate change mitigation finance. Currently, the lack of project-level data makes it difficult to assess the effectiveness of interventions, to identify successful approaches, and to ensure that funds are used effectively for mitigation, as well as for the co-benefits often that these efforts are also contributing to or intended to contribute to, like job creation, poverty reduction, and gender equality. The lack of transparency also hinders the mobilization of private capital, which is crucial to closing the climate finance gap. Investors need to know, to be able to assess the financial as well as the mitigation performance of these projects. That requires data that is rarely publicly available in the portfolios we evaluated. But on the other hand, also project owners and potential originators of projects, mitigation projects, need to understand, how can they contribute with projects, mitigation projects, to a project pipeline. It's not only a matter of lacking financial means, it's also a question of finding mitigation projects. Greater transparency is also needed to ensure additionality, meaning that the funds that we actually have are truly catalyzing new investments and not simply duplicating the efforts of other development actors. The evaluation found many instances where multiple DFIs, the three that we evaluated, but many others, invested in the same projects, raising concerns on the potential for overlap or low value add. And ultimately, transparency is vital for maintaining credibility and trust in climate finance efforts, both domestically from a donor country perspective, but also internationally. So with that, thank you. I'll hand over to you again, Megan.
Thank you so much. Really interesting piece of work, and I'm excited to hear now from our other panelists about their perspective. Let me turn first to Oskar. What can you tell us about the links, maybe any reflections you might have on what you just heard, but also I'd like to hear about the work that you've been doing in EBRD on green bonds. And what is the evidence about green bonds in their role to support mitigation? Over to you, Oskar. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Megan, for that question, and good morning, everyone. Firstly, let me start by saying that historically, the bulk of EBRD climate finance has been for mitigation rather than adaptation. For instance, in 2023, from a total of 4.6 billion USD of climate finance approved by EBRD, 4 billion or 87% was for mitigation. But to tackle your question head on, Megan, perhaps let me pick a specific example of green bonds and how has the EBRD been trying to support the mitigation via this specific sustainable finance instrument. So last year, as part of the evaluation completed by independent evaluation department at EBRD, we looked at EBRD's investments in green bonds made over the period 2017-2022. And while the bank has been also a major issuer of green bonds, our research focused exclusively on EBRD's investments in green bonds issued either by local banks or corporates in the countries where EBRD operates. And just to put that into perspective, the cumulative EBRD investments in green bonds over that period was 1.25 billion euros. Not an extraordinary amount, but not a negligible one either. And so what have we found? Firstly, EBRD investments via green bonds did help to mobilize the mitigation finance. More than 1/3 of bank investments went into so-called first-time issuers, corporates and banks that were first ever issuers of green bonds, either in the countries or respective sectors, some of them in emerging markets like Turkey, Georgia, Egypt, where there were no or very little prior issuances of green bonds. So in certain instances, it really did help to pioneer the instrument itself. The EBRD has also its own way of investing in green bonds. And after evaluating a number of trades, we thought that the term trusted anchor investor is apt. When EBRD invests, it typically comes early in the process of book building order for a given bond, which gives issuers much comfort, but it also allows bonds underwriters to deliver some encouraging updates early on, which may in turn attract some investors. EBRD is typically among top 3 investors by the size. It also keeps bonds till maturity rather than flipping the asset shortly after the issuance on security markets. Again, a feature which is appreciated by a number of issuers. And importantly, it invests solo or via private placements only exceptionally. And this is much harder way of doing business, but it gives higher chance of crowding in private investors. However, the less rosy conclusion we reached is that there are objective limits in terms of how much mitigation finance MDBs can really crowd in via investments in green bonds. And there has been perhaps some discrepancy as well in terms of high hopes and the actual market reality, in particular in the context of emerging markets. We found that there is a weak evidence of EBRD direct mobilization, and it very much boils down to the nature of capital markets. When the bank or other investors intends to invest in a green bond, this is not disclosed in the bond prospectus, and fundamentally, investors do not interact with each other pre and throughout the book building process. And so one may ask about that signaling or catalytic effect of EBRD or other MDBs, which is arguably much less evident. Also, shallow domestic debt markets limit what can be realistically done in many countries. In some small markets, there may be very few issuances, whether ordinary bonds or green bonds, and so naturally very few opportunities for MDBs to invest in green bonds and hence mobilize climate finance. So there is also no quick fix or easy way around that. So it's probably fair to say that green bonds are not a silver bullet. They should be rather seen as part of a mosaic of available approaches. And lastly, Megan, we have argued that rather than simple investment volumes, what may matter at least equally much in green bond markets these days is the quality of green bonds in which MDBs like EBRD choose to invest. Here our report points to a few challenges, but I will mention just two. First, we found that 70% of EBRD investments in green bonds went into issuers that use them to refinance the existing debt rather than invest in new assets. And this arguably leads to lower environmental additionality. And secondly, environmental impact reporting by green bond issuers has not been good enough. And it links very clearly to the point of transparency that Numi alluded to, because insufficient impact disclosure is really problematic when investors want to assess the greenwashing risk. And it also chokes off the flows of sustainable finance into sustainable projects in emerging markets. So in a nutshell, in EBRD case, simply investing in green bonds in early days, say 2017, maybe 18, maybe 2019, was a reasonable approach. But since then, markets have come a long way. They're much more mature. Investors' awareness about greenwashing, the sophistication, the appetite for bonds of sound credentials rose markedly. And by default, MDBs like EBRD need to adapt as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Oskar. And from our work reviewing a number of evaluations, including some work done by EBRD, we really heard very often this point that you made about the focus on volumes of financing as opposed to looking at the actual additional impact in terms of either climate mitigation or other development outcomes. So really interesting findings there. And I also picked up on your point about the question of relevance and the usefulness of bonds as an instrument has changed over time as the market conditions have changed globally, as well as I imagine in specific country contexts. So really important nuances there, I think, to the overall messaging. So now let's turn to the EIB and hear a little bit from our panelist, Ombeline de Bock. Can you tell us a bit more about the EIB's experience with green bonds and other types of green financing? And maybe you have some differing views than Oskar and Numi. Thanks.
Thank you, Megan, and good morning, everyone. So first of all, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present specific findings of a few ongoing, but also some past evaluations in the evaluation division of the EIB. So based on an evaluation we conducted of the EIB's green bonds and the more recent developments shared by the team in charge of the green bonds, let me highlight maybe three roles that the EIB's green bonds played in shaping this green financing. And first, I just want to clarify that we took a bit of an opposite angle to what Oskar presented, because the evaluation focused to the EIB as an issuer of green bond instead of as a green bond investor. And so first of all, maybe let me highlight the policy value of the green bonds. So the EIB inaugurated the green bond market in 2007. Can you still see me? Is there an issue there? So in 2007, with the issuance of the world's first use of proceeds green bonds, so the EIB's green bonds eligible projects contribute substantially to one objective, which is climate change mitigation. All the other environmental objectives are covered by our sustainability bonds. So it quickly became clear that there was a lack of common language and standardization, particularly in the field of impact reporting. And there was a need for higher transparency and regulation to minimize the risk of greenwashing and ensuring investors' trust was maintained. The EIB has there played a pioneering role in developing market governance and standards, advocating for the establishment of an EU definition of the single set of legislative criteria for the assessment of sustainable economic activities, which is the EU taxonomy. So that was the priority. And the bank was also at the forefront of the development of the green bond principles and started to gradually align its green bonds with the evolving EU sustainable finance legislation. So the EIB has appointed an external auditor validating with reasonable assurance its green bonds activities. And now it also provides advice to the EU platform on sustainable finance to facilitate the uptake of the EU green bond standards in the markets. Outside of the EU, the bank is also actively involved in global efforts aimed at developing a common language in sustainable finance. So there, I just wanted to make the point that the EIB green stamp, if you want, could be a distinctive feature that acts as a catalyzer for raising the green ambitions of projects and helping to increase the pipeline of green projects. And then a second interesting aspect is the market value of the green bonds. So the fact that green bond enhance the clarity is valued by investors and also explains the strong growth of the segment in the past 10 years. The bank has meanwhile issued 85 billion of euros of green bonds with assurance, and so it's the largest issuer of green bonds. Now, I also wanted to flag here under the market value this extra green bond premium or issuer bonus. So green and conventional bonds of the same issuer have the same credit merit and therefore largely the same price. However, moderate outperformance in the secondary market has been sufficient to add to investors' interest in new issuance, so growing the order books and supporting the execution of new issues, all conditions equal. So the evaluation at the time found that this greenium was not systematic nor sizable enough, but that there was potential there in the sense that in theory it could allow the issuer to offer cheaper financing to eligible projects, thus incentivizing green investments. And maybe my third and last point based on this experience is that the EIB introduced recently in 2023 the Green Bond Purchase Program, which is a new product for the EIB to address the climate and environment funding needs. So until the rollout of this program, the EIB has not really been active on the market as an investor. And since the launch of the program, the EIB has provided advisory services and supported counterparts in issuing their first green bonds by bringing liquidity and crowding in other investors through this signaling effect. And since the launch of this program, the EIB subscribed close to 750 million euros of green bonds. And outside of the European Union, the EIB has signed up to the Global Green Bond Initiative. So this is a coalition of development finance institutions to support the development green bonds markets through technical assistance and capital mobilization. Thank you, Megan. Those were the 3 points I wanted to raise.
Super. Thank you so much for sharing those perspectives from EIB's work. We will now turn to Tabitha Olang, who works with the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which is, of course, very centrally placed right in between these two areas of work that we've been discussing, between the energy transition towards reducing greenhouse gases and at the same time addressing energy access, energy poverty, and addressing other poverty-related goals. So Tabitha, please tell us a bit more about your experience and the connections of the finance discussion with rural livelihoods and leveraging green energy for households.
Thanks, Megan, and happy to be here to share the GEAPP experience on ground with regards to how we are working towards catalyzing economic development and improving rural livelihoods by leveraging green energy access to boost agricultural activity. Agriculture remains a very central part in the livelihoods of young rural women, and they're deeply affected by the limitations of smallholder farming. And so in many instances, their work is hampered by poverty, lack of access to essential services such as energy, inputs, education, know-how, and the increasing instability caused by climate change. And so the heavy reliance on of agriculture to rainfall leaves them very vulnerable to extreme weather fluctuations, and this further compounds their challenges. One proven solution is the introduction of productive use of energy appliances in agriculture and in food processing. And so our organization, the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, grant-funded the Rocky Mountain Institute, who then supported the Nigerian Rural Electrification Agency to launch and develop the Energizing Agriculture Program, which essentially aimed to connect energy access to improved agricultural livelihoods in Nigeria. And so what this intervention essentially did was it built an in-depth analysis to help local communities prioritize use cases of electricity in the agricultural value chain. So which of these had the strongest potential to increase incomes and support rural development? This program also facilitated partnerships. It's not enough to just figure out where will you get the most impact, but also who are these unlikely partners that you bring together to the table to make this work? So who are the equipment distributors, the productive use appliance service providers, and who are the energy providers who will power these appliances? And then the program also helped develop and de-risk commercial business models, because we are targeting last mile populations and you don't want to leave them behind, especially if you want to realize a just energy transition. And so who are these which are these commercial business models that would deliver electrical equipment to this last mile population? And if the productive use appliance breaks down, do they know where to actually go access operations and maintenance services within their communities? The program also made deliberate efforts to ensure that there is gender equality and social inclusion considerations, so that we are also not exacerbating unintended consequences within these communities. With this program, which ran from 2002 to 2004, this year, we're actually in the process of closing out. We were able to realize the deployment of 300 units of productive use of energy across 40 communities. And this impacted the livelihoods of about 3,000 people in rural Nigeria, considering the household size and the local businesses that sprouted. And also 67% of the productive use of energy the appliance owners under the program were women, which surpassed the program target of 40%. And this was, we took this as quite a win. And this was because of the intentionality in the design phase to ensure that we were intentional in targeting the rural women as well and not leaving them behind. Just in conclusion, the higher incomes earned by these equipment owners, we can see from testimonials and from our program evaluations that some of these incomes are channeled into school fees, things like supplemented household food budgets. And this overall led to the improvement of the well-being of entire rural communities. So back to you, Megan.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tabitha, for that great example illustrating really the potential for green energy and improving green energy access to secure and inclusive and resilient future for all. I appreciate that example. Thanks. Let's go for one more round from our panelists. We'll go first to you, Oskar, reflecting a bit on each of your presentations and also on what Numi shared at the beginning. We hear a lot about the importance of mobilizing private capital. So I'm curious if you also explored in your work the perspective of private investors. What's attracting them, what's holding them off, what do you see as the bottlenecks, and how have you explored that perspective within your work?
Thanks so much, Megan. Excellent question. I will probably not be very original saying that mobilizing private finance at speed and scale is vital to have even a remote chance to meet net zero. As someone wise said, winning slowly is the same as losing. And as part of our evaluation, we actually made a very conscious and extra effort to reach out to some leading private green bond investors and underwriters, i.e. JP Morgan, ING, BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, Amundi, and a few others, to seek their perspective, to actually see what makes them tick. And there were two themes which came out clearly again and again. First one, in search of maximizing impact, there has been a shift across many investors who've been increasingly demanding green bonds with no or limited share of refinancing, and instead favored green bonds where proceeds are used by issuers to invest in new assets. It has to be said that some investors are still agnostic, but many nowadays want to see at least 50-50 split and ideally no refinancing at all. And EBRD can be certainly more aspirational in promoting this type of bonds. And the second point, and I'm repeating myself, and it's probably an issue which is even more pressing, has been still an insufficient quality of environmental impact reporting by green bond investors. Without a reasonable chance to analyze ex-ante impacts of green bonds, investors essentially don't have a way to assess the reputational risk, check whether there are any risks related to greenwashing. No one wants to buy and hold green bonds of dubious credentials with exaggerated impact claims. For instance, in the recent survey of over 60 green bond funds made by Environmental Finance, more than half of these funds stated that poor data and impact reporting were key deterrents from making further investments. So making sure that green bonds have strong green credentials is not really a side issue anymore. It is a paramount topic that has been driving the markets. And if MDBs like EBRD wish to continue to champion the development of green bond markets, and hopefully with that, bring the incremental contribution to bridge the gap, the investment gap. They need to step up their efforts and demand high-end standards from green bond issuers in which they invest. In practice, it may entail several things. MDBs can, for instance, demand much more in terms of impact reporting standards that they ask from green bond investors, including transparency on methodologies, but also once the bond is issued on the market, they should follow up, and in cases where that reporting is not up to the standard, keep issuers accountable. MDBs can also be more explicit in terms of type of bonds they would like to see and invest in, and I refer back again to the case of refinancing versus new assets. And lastly, perhaps more strategically, and we hope at IEVD to see some very good progress on that front in EBRD soon, MDBs that have green bond investment programs should also articulate very clearly which markets, which issuers, what type of bonds they intend to prioritize. For instance, first-time issuers versus repeated issuers. Do they want to invest in the EU or maybe focus on emerging markets where doing the business is more difficult, but the upside of that is the promotion of green bond instrument, and it's more a long-term game. So those questions have very practical implications, and they should be answered in an articulate way by MDBs. So those would be my two very quick thoughts on that question.
Super, thank you, Oskar. And I think really useful to have some quite practical suggestions there on also what multilaterals can do to help stimulate the private finance. I think what we've seen is that the only thing going from billions to trillions very quickly is indeed the levels of pollution in the atmosphere. So helpful to have some thoughts on what to do instead. Let's turn now to Ombeline de Bock. Can you share with us a little bit more? I mean, we've heard from several about how important it is to mobilize finance for climate change mitigation. And I'm wondering, are the tools that we currently have at our disposal, are they really up for the challenge? And if not, what would you see as the innovative products or services that could maybe be more suited to the urgency of the current climate crisis and for the need for investments scaling up at pace and at scale?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Megan, and sorry for the lack of video here. So yes, maybe first, based on the preliminary findings of the ongoing evaluation of my colleagues are performing on the EIB Group's contribution to climate action and environmental sustainability, I just wanted to unpack a little bit this climate change mitigation financing first. So as is the case for the EBRD, as we heard, most of the EIB's green financing is channeled towards climate change mitigation. So this is over 80% of the EIB's green finance. And within this climate change mitigation financing, our evaluation found that the EIB mostly supports investments in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and sustainable transport, as we heard also from other panelists. And it also supports large investments in battery manufacturing plants. Now, I think in order to coordinate support to climate change mitigation efforts, it's important to also think in terms of comparative advantages. So financiers such as the EIB are in a position to finance, of course, large infrastructure projects. And as we know, the investment gaps in the renewable energy sector are huge. So there is a need to finance not only new power generation facilities, but the whole chain too, so including upgrading of power transmission and distribution infrastructure. Now, the EIB aims to decrease the cost of capital needed to support these investments, which is all the more so important in countries with high level of debts and a reduced fiscal space. So in this context, having several financiers supporting the same projects might not be a major issue. So Numi also mentioned the difficulty of originating operations. Our evaluations, so the climate adaptation one and the ongoing one, have found that the EIB encountered this issue more so in the area of climate change adaptation and environmental sustainability, so particularly in the preservation and restoration of biodiversity, actually. But that being said, Our evaluation also shows that in countries with weak utilities and oversight agencies, it is more difficult to finance renewable energy operations because of this weak capacity, the absence of a functioning market for the sale and purchase of electricity, etc. So in this regard, there is a clear need for more technical assistance and advisory services. And the EIB is providing more advisory services to its clients, but much more is needed, particularly to engage upstream and to develop capacity at all the levels. So now about these innovative products. Yes. So for me, there is a need to innovate and expand.
Quickly, thank you. Yep. Go ahead if you want to say one word on the innovative products. That's fine. Yeah.
No. So it's just, yes, I think the question, however, in most instances, the tweaks or enhancements of existing products offer might be sufficient. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ombeline. And Tabitha, now let's go to you. Can you share any trade-offs or synergies that you identified when you were looking at the Energizing Agricultural Program in rural Nigeria? Did these trade-offs actually manifest in the work with the communities? Please.
Thanks for that question. I think I'll lean towards the synergies because it was very interesting. When you're targeting last mile communities, that means that most of them, the grid has not arrived where they are. And so the most viable energy sources are like solar mini grids, solar home systems. And so for the longest time, the reason why productive use appliances are not reaching these populations is there's no data on whether they actually have enough energy consumption for it to be a viable business. And so what is happening with this pilot, the program was able to demonstrate that once these last mile communities have access to energy, then they also want to use energy and they want more and more of that. And so what was interesting was that the productive use companies, their plants distributors started advocating for more mini grid developers to go to those sites. And so that was quite a win because these communities could wait 20, 30 years until the grid arrives, or could wait for something to happen for the mini grid developers to see, oh, this is a viable business. But because of that pilot, and we were able to demonstrate that they are also a viable customer base, it really helped. And so hopefully they'll be able to access and use green energy, and that would help them improve their livelihoods.
Excellent. I think a really rich example demonstrating how this sort of demonstration effect can prove that there are actually unmet needs, not only in terms of the well-being of the communities impacted, but also in terms of the commercial interest of other investors who could then be much more interested in scaling up mini grids. So really good example again. Numi, let's go to you for some additional reflections. I think you highlighted in your evaluation, and we've also seen risks referred to by several of the other panelists, about the low additionality in many development finance institutions' contributions. And in fact, we see a lot of sort of double reporting of the types of investments that are being leveraged by different finance operators. So what are the options that you've identified to try to limit this risk? And what can we do to address that challenge?
Yeah.
I'm not hearing you, Numi. I'm sorry. I don't know if others are, but can you try speaking again?
Is it just no one?
Yes, it's okay. Maybe just speak a bit stronger. For some reason, your voice is... Yes,
I'm going to creep up to my microphone here. No, but thanks, Megan, for the question. And I think, yeah, the question of additionality is crucial, of course, because we need to make sure that every dollar, every euro, every Swedish krona is really working towards these efforts. But it's not only financial additionality. Oskar also mentioned the mitigation and additionality. Are we actually financing efforts that are purely creating new mitigation results? So it's a complicated question, but I think the answer is fairly, it's simple. It's, again, transparency. issuers and investors need to be really transparent on, why are we investing in this? What is the data, project level data in these investments? Why are we hoping that this will contribute to mitigation results? Ex ante, the frameworks, standards, methodologies, and so on, and then through these investments to show that you're contributing to change. And of course, for investors, also when they have investments, to say, well, this is our contribution. We might be co-investing with others, but our unique contribution in this deal is something, to articulate that, to show the additionality. Thanks.
Excellent. And I know within the OECD Network on Development Evaluation, this is an issue. We are looking at how can we better coordinate across development finance providers to really look at that issue of what are the results that we're reporting and what is the contribution that we're claiming for ourselves. I see my video image is also falling victim to the energy efficiency requirements of our building. So I apologize if my image is not very clear. Let's take now 1 or 2 questions from the group. I'd like to hear, Tabitha, there's a question for you from the audience. If you could say a few words about the link between mitigation financing and the concept of just energy transition in the global south is the question. So what do you make of those links?
That's a great question. I think I'll just reference to what Oskar said. Oskar mentioned that, for example, like green bonds are not a silver bullet, but one of the solutions. And so there are many ways to look at mitigation, but there's a reason why, and I love that question because of the term just. What does just mean? Whatever solution that we decide that we are going to use for mitigation, is it contextually relevant? Back to the transformational change concept. Because if, for example, like the Energizing Agriculture Program, we just went and provided productive use appliances and we forgot about the young women who don't have a voice, who maybe they can't own anything, then what does that mean? The middle class are the ones who are going to still benefit from the same thing. So if you really want to ensure that you have a just energy transition, it has to be very intentional, it has to be very context specific. And about transparency, we have to be honest about what are the issues here that we are trying to solve, if indeed you want to leave no one behind.
Excellent, thank you. And I really appreciate that call for precision and specificity and for not forgetting who specifically we're aiming to benefit. And maybe we can take those words as inspiration as we come in to our final lightning round, which is my favorite round. And what we want to hear is really, looking forward to the COP, the climate discussions that are coming up, COP29. If you could speak to the heads of delegation or the organizers of the COP and really send them in with one key piece of evidence, what would be that one key message or one key piece of evidence that you would like to see policymakers taking into the COP discussions with them? Let's go to Ombeline first, if that's okay.
Sure. Thank you, Megan. So I would rather like to point to a place where there is actually a lack of evidence. So namely, I think we're really lacking evidence on the impact our projects are having in terms of climate mitigation. So there is an MDB working group actually planning to share their findings at the COP29, working on developing common impact indicators and methodologies for impact indicators. And I think this is a very important part of the discussion in order to take evidence-based discussions.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. Numi, let's go to you. Want to come in on this?
Yes, thanks, Megan. So quickly, I mean, I'm repeating myself a bit, but transparency in climate action and in funding of the finance of climate action. They're negotiating a new financial goal and to be transparent on what that funding actually means so we can follow up on it. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent suggestion. Tabitha, let's go to you.
as the productive use of energy champion, most of the time at COP, we talk about the megawatts, capacity installed, the grids, and then once the electricity comes, then who is supposed to use it? So as we are investing so much on the transmission lines, on the mini grids, let's also in parallel and spontaneously, in parallel at the same time energy efficiency, at the same time invest in the consumption side so that it makes business sense.
Yes, excellent. And I think that perspective of the last mile of, yes, clean energy, but for who and for what purpose is really so important. Thank you. Oskar, any last thought for you on a message for the COP?
Thank you so much, Megan. I would love to have one-to-one with the head of COP, I must confess. I would say this, no doubt there will be cases during this COP, which is actually dubbed as finance COP, where securing further financial commitments will be hard, or if not impossible. But there are already some existing pledges made, money is being spent. And for this, there is still a room to make sure that there is a greater transparency on how this scarce funding is being allocated and what impact does it generate. And so my humble plea to policymakers would be to also press on for measures that may not necessarily require an extra funding, but which may still make a big difference in terms of how well environmental impacts are estimated and how transparent the disclosure on those is. And that in itself can hopefully crowd in some private finance.
Excellent. Thank you all for those messages. And I do hope that there are a number of colleagues participating in today's session who will be attending the COP and who are also supporting decision makers going into the broader climate negotiation. So please do take those messages up. I think if I could be so bold as to add my own to the list, I think we heard a bit about transparency, about effectiveness and impact. I think there's also a need for coherence and policy coherence across national governments, where we see that indeed there are still continuing efforts to invest in the expansion of fossil fuels, which are undermining our own efforts to mobilize private finance on the side of the just energy transition. So I think if we can stop digging ourselves deeper into the hole, that would be a good move as well. It would be really interesting to see additional evidence coming out of the type that GEAPP has shared with us, that Tabitha shared with us today, that really go some way towards helping to unpack these perceptions of trade-offs and actually highlight how the synergies that are available between reaching poverty and inequality goals and also supporting a just transition related to climate goals. So thank you all so much for those perspectives. There have been a number of resources shared in the chat, and the organizers assure me that they will also send out to all of today's participants a list of all of the resources shared and additional resources to support all of you in your ongoing work. I hope that this will be the first of many conversations among the global evaluation community to see how we can also reach more policymakers and get evidence more into the discussions. What I've seen in my personal experience is that in the climate talks and also in our climate strategic actions and finance discussions among many development institutions, we have a lot of talk about mitigation potential, and we have a lot of talk about financing targets. But what's often missing is the link between the two. What are we actually financing and what impacts is it having? Is it efficient? Is it sustainable? And so I think evaluators have a strong role to play in helping to fill in that gap between the finance and the actual outcomes, be they poverty outcomes or mitigation outcomes. So I'm really excited to have been invited by the IEG World Bank and the DEval, German DEval, and I think this is a great opportunity for us to continue to explore how we as evaluators can really step up our own role and our own contribution to the global fight on the climate crisis. Within the DAC Network on Development Evaluation, we are convening a working group on the climate crisis, and that involves many of you and your institutions, as well as many other partners. And we are continuing to look at how we can strengthen the role and use of evaluative evidence in the COPs and in other climate actions. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over now to my partner and colleague Sven Harten from DEval to close us out. As several mentioned at the beginning, today is the fourth and final session of the Evidence for Climate Action. So over to you, Sven, and thank you all for being with us today. And we look forward to hearing more from you and continuing this important work.
Thank you, Megan. Well, after your inspiring words, it's really a hard ask to close this out. I think you made a number of really important points that definitely echo. But first and foremost, I'd like to thank all the moderators, all the presenters, the speakers, but perhaps most importantly of all, the teams behind the screen, the communication teams from IAG, from DEval, and the producers putting up this phenomenal event. So thanks so much for everybody. This has really been a joint team efforts between the two institutions, and I think we can be really proud about the event. We had 4 interesting sessions on 4 different days. It's going to be impossible to really highlight all the rich and inspiring discussions, but just 4 quick points what I personally learned. So on day 1 on the blue economy, which was actually a relatively new topic to me, I learned a lot about the integrated nature of the blue economy and how integrated approaches used and detected by evaluators really can help to leverage the potential, especially in the space of institutional development approaches. So really good practical insights from evaluators there. On Tuesday, on day 2, we talked about resilience, and the session there was really inspiring to me because I think we saw how evaluators can support innovation through sound measurement and also bringing local knowledge to global institutions. And one of those interesting aspects of innovation was we heard the idea of resilience credits that I hope will be discussed intensely at the COP negotiations. Then on day 3, we heard the call for a stronger focus on actual impacts, something that we heard today as well, rather than focusing on financial targets, on money that is spent. Also the call for additional private finance and some insights from evaluators how to leverage this, and the important point about systems change and embracing complexity where we as evaluator can actually help. And today so many important points on mitigation, but definitely I want to echo and repeat the call for transparency in terms of the financing data, but also very importantly about the actual impacts it achieved. And that, for instance, we heard a great example of the green bonds. And again, there, it's not just about the volume, but it's about the quality of those bonds. So with that, dear colleagues around the globe, let me invite you to take those and many of the other insights to COP, engage in discussions in the side events and perhaps also with the negotiating parties, because as we heard repeatedly, time is of the essence, and we really, as evaluators, need to step up our game and put forward evidence to support climate change adaptation efforts and mitigation efforts. And one initiative I'd highlight to closing here is that together with World Bank, IAG, DEval, and 10 other partners, some of them being present also throughout these 4 events, we have the initiative of an Evidence for Climate Action Pavilion that we will try for COP30 in Brazil, so that we actually have a place, a pavilion at the COP where evaluators, researchers can come forward, present their neutral evidence on what works and what doesn't, and help to discuss about solutions, but also be very transparent when certain initiatives are not working, because that space is currently lacking, and we as evaluators want and can fill this gap. So many thanks to everybody here on this panel. Have a good rest of the day. Hopefully see you at COP or see you at some other occasion, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.